Troy burned for 10 years before it fell in a single night. Before one of the men who brought it down, the wall was the easy part. Getting home would take just as long, and it would cost him everything except his name. This is the story of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and the 10-year voyage that turned a victorious soldier into a man with nothing left but a single ship and then no ship at all. He left Troy with 12 ships and hundreds of men. Home was less than a 2 week sail away. It would take him a decade to cover that distance, and almost none of his men would live to see the shore with him again. The first stops should have been a footnote. His fleet raided the city of the Ciconians on the way home, took their supplies, and Odysseus told his men to leave before the Ciconians could return with reinforcements. They didn't listen, and by morning the Ciconians came back with an army, and Odysseus sailed away, already having lost men before he'd even cleared the coast of Troy. It was the first sign of a pattern that would define the entire journey: warnings given and warnings ignored. A storm off the coast pushed the fleet far past any coastline his men recognized. They had sailed off the map into waters no story had prepared them for. The first land they found was the island of the lotus eaters, where the fruit of a strange plant made the men forget their homes, their names, and their reason to ever leave. Three of his crew ate it and stopped wanting to go home at all. Odysseus had to drag them back to their ships in chains, weeping, and lash them to the rowing benches just to keep them moving. It was a small island and a small danger, but it was the first proof of something far more threatening than monsters: how easily a man could simply stop trying to get home. The next island belonged to a Cyclops named Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant, and the son of the sea god Poseidon. Odysseus and 12 of his men entered the giant's cave to wait for him, hoping for hospitality, and instead, Polyphemus sealed the entrance with a boulder that no man could move, and he began eating Odysseus' crew two at a time for his dinner. Odysseus' escape is one of the oldest tricks in any story ever told. He gave the Cyclops wine, told him his name was Nobody, and once Polyphemus was drunk, he drove a sharpened stake into his single eye. And when the giant screamed for help and the other Cyclopses outside asked who was hurting him, Polyphemus could only shout that nobody was hurting him, so no help ever came. The next morning, Odysseus and his surviving men escaped by clinging to the undersides of Polyphemus' sheep as the blind giant let them out to graze, feeling only their backs to check for riders. It should have ended there. It didn't. As Odysseus' ship pulled away from the island, safe, he turned back and shouted his true name across the water, unable to resist making sure Polyphemus knew exactly who had beaten him. Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon, asking that Odysseus never reach home, and if he did, that he arrive broken, alone, on a stranger's ship, having lost nearly everything. That single boast, one moment of pride that Odysseus didn't need to indulge in, is the reason the rest of his journey takes 10 years instead of 10 days. Every storm, every wreck, every man he loses from this point forward traces back to the god of the sea, listening to his son's prayer. And for a while, it seems the curse hadn't caught up yet. The god Aeolus, keeper of the winds, gave Odysseus a gift: a leather bag containing every storm wind in the world, sealed shut so that only gentle breezes would guide his ships home. For 9 days it worked. On the 10th day, with Ithaca actually visible on the horizon, Odysseus finally allowed himself to sleep, and his men, convinced the sealed bag held hidden treasure he was keeping from them, opened it. A big mistake. Every storm in the world tore out at once, and the winds drove the entire fleet back across the sea they just had crossed, undoing weeks of progress in a single afternoon. And with Ithaca in sight the entire time it happened, worse followed almost immediately. The fleet reached the harbor of the Lystrogonians, giants who hurled boulders down from cliffs onto the ships trapped in the narrow inlet below, then speared the survivors like fish. 11 of Odysseus' 12 ships were destroyed in minutes. Only his own ship, which he had kept anchored outside the harbor, escaped. He had left Troy with 12 ships and hundreds of men. Now he had one ship and a fraction of his crew. After they escaped, they found the island of the sorceress Circe next, as she turned the first landing party into pigs with a single touch of her wand. Odysseus was only spared because the god Hermes gave him a protective herb beforehand, warning him exactly what he will face. Circe, defeated, became an unlikely ally instead of an enemy, and Odysseus' men stayed on her island for a full year recovering before she gave him the next instruction. And it was not a direction home, it was a direction down. To reach Ithaca, she told him, he first had to sail to the edge of the world and speak with the dead. In the underworld, Odysseus found the blind prophet Tiresias, who told him plainly what still lay ahead: the sirens, the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, and the temptation of the sun goddess cattle, and a warning that if his men would touch these cattle, none of them would ever see home again. And he found the shade of his own mother there too, who had died of grief waiting for him. And he found Achilles, the greatest warrior of the war they had just fought, who told him that he would rather be a living slave serving a poor farmer on earth than rule as a king over all the dead. It was not a comforting place. It was a place that told him clearly that survival was the only victory that could ever actually matter. And after returning to the surface, Odysseus faced the sirens first, creatures whose song was said to be so beautiful that no sailor who ever heard it wanted to leave. He ordered his men to fill their ears with wax so they couldn't hear it, and had himself tied to the mast, arms and legs bound, so he alone could hear the song without being able to steer the ship towards it. He became, as far as the story tells it, the only man who ever heard the sirens sing and actually survived. Next came a strait guarded on either side by two disasters with no good option between them: Scylla, a six-headed monster who would snatch exactly six sailors from the deck as the ship passed, and Charybdis, a whirlpool monster that would swallow the entire ship whole if it sailed too close. Odysseus chose to lose six men to Scylla rather than risk everyone to Charybdis. This was not a victory, it was math. Six men, screaming, were lifted off the deck in front of him, and there was nothing he could do but watch and keep sailing. The surviving crew reached the island of the sun god's cattle next, exactly where Tiresias had warned him not to touch anything. Odysseus made his men swear an oath not to eat the cattle grazing there. Then the winds turned against them, trapping them on the island for a full month, their food supply running short until starvation broke the oath. While Odysseus slept, his men slaughtered and ate the sacred cattle. And days later, at sea again, Zeus, the thunder god, the god of gods, split their ship apart with a single lightning bolt. Every man aboard drowned except Odysseus, who clung to a piece of wreckage and drifted alone for 9 straight days. After drifting for all this time, he washed ashore on the island of the nymph Calypso, and there his journey simply stopped for 7 years. Calypso offered him immortality, a permanent place at her side, an end to all further suffering, if he only would stay. He said no. Every night for 7 years, the story tells us, he sat on the shore of an island where he was safe, fed, and desired by a goddess, and wept, because none of it was his home. It took the gods themselves intervening, Zeus ordering Calypso to let him go before Odysseus was finally permitted to build a raft and try again. Poseidon, still watching, still holding his grudge from a name shouted across the waters years earlier, wrecked the raft in a final furious storm, leaving Odysseus to swim for 2 straight days, alone, before washing up, naked and half dead, on the shore of the Phaeacians. A princess named Narcissa found him there. The Phaeacians, moved by his story once he told it, gave him a ship, a crew, and a safe passage home at last, with no further condition attached to it. And after 10 years, Odysseus finally reached Ithaca, but not as a conquering king returning in triumph, but exactly as Polyphemus had once prayed he would, alone, broken, and on a stranger's ship. The goddess Athena disguised him as a beggar before he set foot on his own land, and for good reason as well. In his absence, over 100 suitors had taken over his household, consuming his livestock, drinking his wine, and pressuring his wife Penelope to remarry, certain that Odysseus was dead. Penelope had held him off for years with a single trick. She promised to choose a husband once she finished weaving a burial shroud, then secretly unravel every night's work by torchlight, buying herself time she was no longer sure would ever pay off. Disguised, unrecognized, Odysseus watched his own home being devoured from the inside before he did anything at all. He confirmed himself only to his son, Telemachus, in secret and then waited. Penelope, still not knowing the beggar in her hall was her husband, set one final test for the suitors. Whoever could string Odysseus' old hunting bow and fire an arrow through the aligned handle of 12 axe heads in a row would win her hand. One by one, the suitors failed to even bend the bow, and the beggar asked to try. He strung it on the first attempt, fired the arrow clean through all 12 axes, and before anyone in the hall understood what was happening, he turned the bow on the suitors themselves. What followed was not a duel, it was a reckoning 10 years in the making, and by the end of it, every suitor who had spent a decade consuming Odysseus' home lay dead on its floor. Even then, Penelope did not simply embrace a stranger claiming to be her husband. She tested him one final time, asking a servant to move their marriage bed out of the room. Odysseus, without thinking, immediately said it was impossible. He had built that bed himself around the trunk of a living olive tree, rooted into the ground, and it could not be moved without destroying it. Only her real husband could have ever known that, and it was the detail Penelope had been waiting 10 years to hear. The war at Troy took 10 years to win. The journey home took 10 more and cost Odysseus every ship, every soldier, and nearly his own life. Over a single boast, he didn't have the discipline to hold back. It is easy to remember the Odyssey as a story about monsters, Cyclops, and sirens, but underneath the monsters, it's a story about the distance between winning and actually getting to go home, and about how much of that distance a man can end up traveling alone because of one thing he said in a moment of pride. If you found Odysseus' journey home as unrelenting as I did, subscribe for more of these deep dives into the stories behind history's most enduring myths. And let me know in the comments which part of the journey you think truly cost him the most: the pride at the Cyclops cave, or the 7 years he spent refusing to accept a home that wasn't his own, even though he was desired by a goddess. I'll see you in the next one.